Hello and welcome to the What If podcast. My name is Nontsikelelo Nzula, and today I'm joined by Dr. Murisa Tendai, and he is the Executive Director of CVO Institute. Tendai, welcome once again.
Thank you very much for having me, Nonsi.
You are welcome. Today we are going to be talking about what if there is an alternative. In our last episode, we spoke about policy making. And through our policy making, that is what will direct the trajectory of our development as a nation. So with that being said, Tendai, could you just tell us what is the development of Zimbabwe looking like at the moment?
Yeah, so I think the title of this podcast is interesting because in itself, it's a very radical idea, because for years, some of us in the development space, we've been told there's no alternative. Starting with the Margaret Thatcher days and Ronald Reagan, they coined TINA, there is no alternative. And this was there is no alternative to a certain form of capitalist development, capitalist accumulation driven by the market, etc. And Margaret Thatcher at that time had been spearheading a very robust, thoroughgoing privatization process in the UK, and also Ronald Reagan was also pushing some similar reforms, leading to a thinking that was called the Washington Consensus, which really was talking about Washington institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and the United States government as a sort of a new consensus around the world, the new world order, and there was no alternative to it. And this new world order was going to be based on markets or a framework of capitalism that is driven by what you may call laissez-faire capitalism. So, but now with this podcast, you are framing it around what if there's an alternative. That already is sort of something that is of interest for some of us who've been in the space for years. And your question now to say, can you frame Zimbabwe's development trajectory? I think Zimbabwe's development trajectory is characterized by contradictions. The first contradiction being, on the face of it, the government of Zimbabwe is one of the few in Africa and even globally that has tried to row against the tide, where we are finding consolidation and strengthening of a hegemonic framework around capital development driven by the Washington Consensus framework. Come 1999, 2000, 2001, 2003, the government of Zimbabwe rose against that framework by redistributing land, because at the central tenet of the framework of accumulation globally has always been about property rights, sanctity of property rights, like a religion, that this is not an issue that you compromise on. So that has been one marker of Zimbabwe. And Samir Amin captures it well, saying it rose against the tide of what we have seen elsewhere. But I say it's a contradiction because where we expected that with the onset of that kind of thorough undoing of a colonial structure, land ownership patterns, we expected to see a new vision, a new framework, or an alternative, using your language. But we actually see a continuation of the same. That what we have now is new characters, new types of farmers, but trying to work within the logic of the broader capitalist framework accumulation. So on the one hand, giving us the promise of an alternative, but on the other hand, actually continuing with the model that was already in place. And that's where we are today. What we have done is we've seen the consolidation of a certain neoliberal approach to economics, which is driven mostly by private sector. But in our case, it's interesting that even the state has been an enabler of private sector accumulation, with halting attempts at sort of intervening to rescue things to do with prices, inequality. But the common thread has been that this government and its previous one have done very well to service the interests of capital, local and international.
Right, I think that is well said. You mentioned one element of development, which is the agrarian sector.
Yeah.
Can we look at other forms of development and your thoughts around those? I mean, I guess infrastructure-wise, we are thriving. If you, like you said in the previous podcast, when you drive around, whether it's Harare, you're going down all the way to Bulawayo, you're seeing construction happening. Does that count as a, well, moving in the right direction type of development?
Yeah, to many, yes. To many, what has always been a marker, and even the current Minister of Finance has made it clear how he views infrastructure. Infrastructure is dear to him, big infrastructure projects, just not him as the minister, but also the president. They value the idea of big projects. So they are doing roads, they are doing dams, they've made huge progress around Gwaishangani, etc. So it's dear to them. And it's around a modernization approach based on infrastructure. And actually, Orthodox economics actually says that this is the best way of reviving an economy. If you invest in big projects, there's trickle down. The trickle down theory that the money invested in the building of a bridge is going to benefit different tiers of capital. The big companies, the smaller companies that service them, and even hopefully the communities around them. So there's always the assumption that when you make such big bets on infrastructure, you're going to find yourself sort of moving development to the lower levels through the trickle-down theory. But in effect, it's uneven. We don't see it that way. We see actually what you may call enclave-like development. That's small islands of development. So for instance, if you look in construction, you can count the number of construction companies that have benefited from this huge infrastructure drive that we have had since 2018, 2019, thereabouts. So there could be 4, there could be 5, and you could see the accumulation appetite, that they are just not doing roads, they are now even buying a cement company, they are divesting into other things, they're becoming fertilizer companies, etc. But based on what? The big infrastructure projects they are getting from government. So it creates its own thing. It creates a new kind, for Zimbabwe, it has created a new kind of a nationalist bourgeois, or a bourgeois that is literally based in Zimbabwe and is accumulating in Zimbabwe. It's not yet certain whether it's also serving in Zimbabwe, whatever it has earned. Because the challenge with international bourgeois coming through the multinationals has always been the challenge that they externalize their profits. They have to take them out. So we're yet to measure this. But with the kind of sort of investments we're seeing, there is some argument to make to say this new breed, with its political connections, etc., but actually it reinvests in Zimbabwe.
I understand that, I get it. So if we're looking at, we've spoken about Agarian, we spoke about construction and buildings. For the ordinary person, is this something that is helpful for them in their development? What are your thoughts on that?
So this goes back to your what if there's an alternative. So for some of us, we see opportunities for the small man or small woman, small business in all the value chains we've mentioned. So let me use roads as something that we have tried to push even at Seville Institute, to begin to say when you are reviving roads, and I was excited to see that the governor of Mashonaland West also raised it when they were commissioning the Harare-Chirundo highway. She mentioned it this way. She says, we want to see this converting into opportunities for the locals. That as you are doing roads, communities benefit, the youths in those communities benefit. But for us, we're even more bold. You know, we said there is a need to think through what you may consider maybe road brigades. Create youths into small brigades, companies that do all the manual work. So you can actually deal with the problem of unemployment when you are doing these big projects, because you now employ them, even housing issues, roads, etc. You employ the youths to do some of the work. You create opportunities for them through that. In the early independence days, we used to call them food for work programs, but I call it a popular sort of approach to how you sort of bring in the youths into these road projects. But you hear experts again saying, no, we want our roads to be done a certain standard, etc., etc. So in effect, sort of demarcating the space to say this is a space for a very expert engineering firm. We cannot have these people who are not trained in anything doing anything. It's a missed opportunity, both economically but also politically, because there's political fodder to be made out of employing youths, especially in a contested terrain like Zimbabwe. When you begin to employ the youths, they may actually begin to sort of subscribe to your political vision.
I see how you've gone down that road. I didn't really want to go down that road, but thank you for taking us there. In the sense of when we now look at youth and their development, and I think it's a great idea and it's a commendable one. But after the road project, then what? How are they developing themselves? But I won't go into that right now, Doc.
Sure.
I know you've got the answer for that.
Sure.
But let's go back and just take a look at, we've spoken about the development. What are the current challenges? What's missing with our development currently?
Yeah, so in your earlier question, you had asked about the two sectors that I mentioned. So the agrarian sector, the construction, modernization sector, which is really about infrastructure. In agriculture, we actually see more opportunities than challenges. So in agriculture, when you track the value chain, the agricultural value chain, and you look at opportunities for participation, there is the agribusiness side, the local agro dealer network, which has collapsed. So if you find that you're in a communal area and you still have to drive or travel over 100 kilometers to buy seed, that means the local agro dealer network does not exist. And many communities face that challenge, access to inputs, the distance they have to cover. But if you're to deliberately, through the Ministry of Youth or other ministries, or SMEs, begin to set up the youth to be local agro dealers. So they have little stores, which could be containers, big warehouses, where they actually begin to be trusted dealers who work on behalf of seed companies, fertilizer companies, etc. So you're shortening the distance. So we always say to people, there's more to farming than just tilling the land. So you've already created a site of accumulation, business, etc. Then when you move into the actual production, what we are facing as a challenge in the communal areas and in the newly resettled areas is because due to lack of productive infrastructure, the land that is being deployed into production is getting smaller and smaller. But if you were to trust a cooperative of the youths or a cooperative of young girls or women with equipment, so with this mechanization project program years ago, which was sort of taken from the top, just prioritize those who are connected, those who are in government. But if you flip that and you begin to look for affordable infrastructure, affordable machinery, these could be diesel-powered tractors, smaller ones, etc. Then you begin to say a cooperative of 10 to 12 youths running that. So they become now responsible for tilling the land in that particular ward or those particular wards, 3 or 4 wards. So already you have taken away the challenge of saying, how do we make sure that we increase the land that can be tilled? So you've already created an opportunity. And for the youths who are slightly more educated, you then bring on into issues to do with technical backstopping, setting up irrigation, drip irrigation. You begin to move them into new markets, horticulture, etc. So there are many opportunities without even considering giving them land.
Right.
Just looking at how they can also benefit from the value chain of land. So finally, after production, we know about the post-harvest losses. What if we thought about really innovative schemes of value addition on the farm?
Right.
On the farm, before we even start off transporting, just on the farm to make sure that this is resolved. So if you really look at the sort of the example I've given you in agricultural value chains, you can create in one community 100 jobs just by looking at the different opportunities that exist. Because the challenge with our agriculture, since the 1950s up to now, our agriculture is the same. It still exports, it still sells primary goods, very limited value addition. Yeah, so you may find that in the rural areas where groundnuts are grown, there's a challenge of peanut butter. Yeah. Well, it's a machine to do that is worth less than $200. And if you were to set up 4 or 5 young girls, they can run a peanut butter making company in the village, supplying first the members of the village and then the next city. So there are many opportunities that we're not thinking of because of these big ideas. Because when this government in 2017 came in, especially going into the elections of 2018, it ran their campaign on the basis of attracting investment. They argued that Zimbabwe is open for business. So everything that we've done, even the National Investment Authority and many other, ZIDA, etc., they were really focused on attracting external investors. But we've seen that in many instances, and this is where what if there's an alternative? In many instances, foreign direct investment has not created the jobs it claims to do. And it has not brought the capital that it claims to do. In other instances, foreign direct investments comes actually to borrow from local banks. So it actually saturates domestic borrowing. But in our case, we have a fairly sophisticated savings infrastructure around our pensions, around NASA and private pensions. So if you're really to look at those savings and we begin to say, let's talk, instead of foreign direct investment, let's talk about domestic resource mobilization. So we mobilize resources from the market and we begin to deploy them to support the smallholder agricultural sector, which is underfinanced. Like I said, there are many opportunities there. But let's forget about agriculture for a bit because people may think I'm just talking about the rural. Let's go into the informal sector, which again is a wrong term that we use. That's a cottage industry. There's a lot of manufacturing, there's a lot of innovation going on in that sector, but it's underfinanced. And we treat them as at the periphery of the market. So we don't really give them patient finance, we don't give them opportunities to scale up, we don't give them tax incentives to do so. So while if you really look for what you're calling, what if there's an alternative, that's your site of growth. Your growth is not going to come from the large industries because they're inefficient, they are saddled with debt, they're saddled with old infrastructure. But give these SMEs that employ 10, 15 people or less, they have energy, they are hungry for it, they're entrepreneur-led. The leader of that enterprise is still alive, he's still leading it. So he is consumed with the idea of growing his enterprise, which is the catalytic force that is required, not your formal CEO who comes to say, so how much are you going to give me? What car am I going to drive? But entrepreneurs are the ones that drive growth. But in our instance, we punish the informal sector because we call them vendors and we attack them during the night. We look for them, we say they are informal traders, we displace them. Yes. So that is where if you were to flip that and to begin to think of it as an opportunity, that's when you begin to realize that we are sitting on an asset, a gold mine that we currently call the informal sector.
Tendai, you've said a lot, and what I'm getting from what you have said is we need to look inward and we kind of need to identify opportunities. Maybe that's where we're lacking. So in all of this, who are we leaving behind?
Yeah, I think so. There are two important things you have raised. Let's start off by saying looking inward. That's an asset-based approach. I think, and for some reason, African governments fail on this one because I think there's a deficit mindset that we focus mostly on what we don't have. So we fail to leverage what we have. Africa is rich and yet poor. That's a contradiction because the poverty is not in assets, the poverty is in mindsets. That's the real challenge because if you're really to compare, let's compare Singapore or South Korea and Ghana. 1957, both of them get their independence. Ghana is endowed with natural resources. Ghana is far ahead in terms of its natural resource base. But right now, South Korea is a developed country. Ghana is not yet a developed country. So flip it whatever way you want politically, make excuses. But there's something that is deficient in African governments. It's the model that we're pursuing. We are not yet committed to a resource-based, a natural resource-based approach to our development. We are committed to seeing quick cash, FDI. Investor will come, put money and do it. So we are not committed to a slow and patient build-up to say we have this gold. What becomes of gold after it's being mined? Very few people in Zimbabwe have touched gold because we don't see it, because we don't have a gold sector in Zimbabwe to say, or if you go to the gold district where people are making jewels, etc., etc. So we develop expertise in jewelry because we've got gold, we've got diamonds, we've got emeralds from Berengwa. So we can begin to say we have a gold or a jewelry sector. We don't have a jewelry sector. It doesn't contribute zilch to GDP.
What do you think the problem is? Why are we like that?
We are not patient. So we have a quick fix. The quick fix is somebody is going to come and mine this gold and export it for us and we get money. But we don't realize that we're getting a tenth where we could have gotten 100% of it. Because for everything that we produce, the moment somebody touches it or bends it or adds value and puts a pepper of it, calls it a cigar, the value grows exponentially. So we are still focused on exporting gold in its bar form. Same with our diamonds, same with our emeralds. That's one. We're still excited to say how many bales of tobacco did we export.
Yeah.
If we look at how much cigars are we producing, we could be competing with Cuba around the cigar industry, but we only have one cigar company. It's a very small company. Yeah. So all the other companies that we call the tobacco sector, they're just exporters, except for those who make cigarettes. But also, again, we don't export as much cigarettes as we should. Because given the fact that we are the dominant force in tobacco production in Southern Africa into East Africa. So you should be finding our cigarettes all the way to Kenya. But you don't. Because what we export mostly is in its primary form. So that's the challenge that we face. And we're not the only ones. I'm sure you have seen the documentary around cocoa producers, some of them being given chocolate by Richard Quest.
Yes.
They never tasted chocolate, but they were growing cocoa. So we have that challenge to say we do not appreciate the asset base. As a Christian, I always say to people, I'm afraid of the day I'll go to heaven and God will ask me, what did I do with all that He blessed me with? Living in a country that is so endowed with natural resources and using so little of them and yet complaining of poverty. That's a contradiction.
It's a painful question.
Yeah, it's a painful question. But your second question now was about, are we leaving others behind? We're leaving a lot behind. The Zimbabwean model since 2017 has been this accelerated development of a very narrow middle to upper class that is politically connected, that is getting all the state tenders, all this construction I was talking about. There are very few companies benefiting. So the level of inequality in this country is widening. So at the top, we have a growth of real billionaires in US dollar terms who are actually doing infrastructure and all other activities that they do. Then the middle class that we knew as a middle class, consisting of teachers and other professionals, doctors, has been eroded. There's no middle class anymore. So you are either at the top, you are somewhere at the bottom. So there are others who are scrambling to be part of the middle class, but it's very difficult. So we are leaving a lot of people behind. But my worry is, yes, I'm worried about the adults who are leaving behind, but my worry is about the children who are leaving behind. Because if you look at the COVID-19 period, the COVID-19 moment demonstrated in our face the levels of inequality in our country. Those who are going to private school continued with their education. They could get internet, they could do stuff, but those are just a few, less than 5% of this population. Then the majority were struggling to access education. And remember, COVID was there for 2 years. Those were lost years. So kids who went to school during those 2 years lost 2 years of learning. And I'm not so sure if we'll recover that. And there are many other ways. Public health delivery is at its worst at the moment. So we're losing people to conditions that we can easily be treated in other sectors because we are not deploying resources towards revitalizing health delivery. For this government, it does not look like a priority. Health, the social sector, they have not deployed similar energy towards recovery of health or education as we have seen in their infrastructure and other big projects. So again, that's the challenge we face, to say, in the absence of an interventionist developmental state deploying resources and human capital towards resuscitating social service delivery, we actually find that the poor remain poorer or get worse, while it's the rich who can access private goods, private health services, remain sort of stable. So that's the challenge with the current development pattern that we have, that it actually creates haves and have-nots.
Right. So what is the alternative to the challenges that you've just outlined? And maybe possibly, might I say that they're thinking, if we get our construction right, if we get our agriculture right, then the benefits of the growing, industries will then trickle down to the people, the have-nots that you mentioned. So Maybe you could speak a little bit into that to say, is that something that is viable, that could have worked, to say, okay, if we develop this, then, you know, it will come down to everybody else. Is that a realistic expectation?
You see, I think that's the crux of the matter. That's where the debate is around the validity of the trickle-down theory in economics. Because we have been on this rodeo before. This is not the first year we're doing infrastructure. This government has been deploying huge resources towards roads, dams, irrigation schemes, etc. But the question is, where are we beginning to see those benefits? Are we beginning to see better off people, so people can say, because of these projects? No doubt there could be, but in terms of its widespread nature, in terms of its capability to spread itself, to make sure that the development is inclusive and equitable, I think it has limitations. So I think it needs tempering. If you're not going to do away with it, you need to temper with it. So how do you temper with it? You actually begin to identify pockets of marginalization and begin to say, what are you going to do about the agricultural sector? How do you deliberately focus on agriculture to lift people out of poverty? Because the current agricultural framing or framework does not lift people out of poverty. It makes people produce for the urban market. It makes us say we are at a national level, we've achieved food security. But the people who are tilling the land are not getting a fair return on the land. That's the challenge we have. So if you look at how they sort of set up commodity prices, especially around controlled cereals like maize, and you ask yourself, can you compute the labor, the inputs that were put, is that a fair price if somebody is going to be paid $220 per ton or $240 per ton? So that's the real challenge, to say, is agriculture geared towards creating wealth in rural areas, or it's geared towards subsidizing urban lives? At the moment, it's about subsidizing, creating a facile food secure nation, but at the end of the day, it's on the basis of poverty. Because when you begin to get out of poverty, we see the kind of investments you make on your household, the kind of house you live in, the kind of sanitation facilities you have, the kind of modes of transport, the kinds of the diversity of your diet, the access you have to health services. That's when you begin to talk about wealth. But our people, since 1980, when we got our independence, live on those mono diets. They are very limited. Their infrastructure, their houses have not changed. They still live in Rondaville huts since 1980. So it tells you there's something wrong with our agricultural sector. Despite everything we've said about how much we've grown in terms of producing maize, etc., there's something intrinsically wrong about how we are producing, and maybe the decisions we're making on the farms on what to produce.
Right. So what is the alternative?
So there is an alternative. I think it starts off with a mindset shift. So the first mindset shift is to say, let's focus on our assets and see how we can sweat our assets. This is a private sector lingo, right? How to sweat an asset. Mm-hmm. So we have minerals. How are we sweating those assets? How are we creating value chains? How are we making sure that there was a time when the late President Mugabe, issued a moratorium that there was no one was going to export chrome in its raw form, because he was pushing for it, value addition. And he even said the same about platinum. But that moratorium was lifted the moment with a change in government. So we don't have platinum being smelted in this country, which could have created jobs. So if you look at mining, there's a lot of papers, studies that have been done around value addition. Even a diamond city has been envisaged somewhere to say, we've got diamonds, why don't we have a diamond city where we are doing all these diamond related products? So that's one in mining. Now let's go to the informal sector. What is the alternative? Not the informal sector, maybe the urban economy. Like I said, let's stop this term of saying informal. Let's call it the cottage industry, because all the developed countries, they developed on the back of a cottage industry, family run businesses, 5 to 7 members working for them. Let's pump resources into that. Let's make sure that we create incentives for them to formalize. We create tax incentives for them, because when somebody comes as a foreign direct investor, Nonsi, the joke is, one of the things they negotiate for is a tax holiday. And tax holidays are as long as 5 years. But when you try to go and register your bid-making company today, next month we'll expect you to pay taxes.
Yes.
So how are we creating opportunities for you to make sure that you benefit from being Zimbabwean, we seem to prefer outsiders over our people, because we do not even understand the potential of your beat-making business if we had given you a 5-year tax holiday to begin to say you can source goods, you can import goods duty-free as long as you continue to trade and you employ this kind of people, maybe number of 3 people, etc. We're not thinking of those incentives. So we talk of this sector as if it's actually an abnormality, a problem, etc. But that's where actually the majority of our people are eking an existence. Livelihoods are being developed. There are certain children who say that their fathers or their mothers worked in the informal sector to take them through school. They never had a formal sector job. So if we begin to understand that the reality of 40 to 45% of our people is in the informal sector, then we need to change our mindset and to begin to say, how do we make sure that we are creating opportunities here? That's, again, there's an alternative. Yeah.
I think you've put that quite simply. We should look inwards and we should have a lens of opportunity. That's what we should do. So my next question is, what kind of conversations then should we be having as Zimbabweans, as leaders in our different sectors? What should we be talking about right now?
Yeah, so there are 2 kinds of questions that we normally ask, for some of us who work in these spaces and are always in workshops. Towards the end of the workshop, we then ask a question. So what must be done? That's a Leninist question, sort of describing the state agenda, what must be done. The moment you do that, you are taking yourself out of the equation. You are beginning to say somebody should do something. So what we have noticed in many instances, public discussions and recordings like such as these, what we have noticed is people then prescribe what government should do. But I would rather say, what must we do as a collective? What must we do? So for me, it's big terms, big things that we need to be thinking about. Trust. How do we use trust to leverage assets? Because when we did our study in 5 countries, in Ghana, Cameroon, Malawi, Kenya, and Zimbabwe, what we noticed was the level of citizen-to-citizen solidarity, even in economic activities, was the least in Zimbabwe. Yeah. So we really lend to each other. We really do this. So we're waiting for somebody. We're literally waiting for the Messiah. So we need to change that mindset and begin to say, what are the problems that we can fix amongst ourselves? So because if you really look at enterprises, entrepreneurs globally, and you ask them, who gave you the first loan? It's rarely government. It's usually family, friends, and other networks. So we should consider that, to say we are the ones who are failing our entrepreneurs because we are not supporting each other. So we need to rethink our trust. So there's the Igbo tribe in Nigeria. They have a mentoring system whereby one who is established always lives with other youngsters who are yet to be established, mentoring them in business. And these people work for you for 3 to 4 years without really receiving a fair compensation. But after they've done that mentorship, you then do what they call setting up. Then they set you up, they give you the initial capital to set up your business.
That sounds a lot like the Jewish community, no?
Something like that. But the Igbos, they've really perfected it and they're doing it very well. So people always wonder when you're going to countries like South Africa and you see Somalis doing well and Nigerians doing well, you don't understand how they are financing each other. Yeah. So it's a continuous responsibility because you've also been financed by somebody else who's not necessarily a family member. You have an obligation to finance the next person. So we don't yet have that here in Zimbabwe. Yeah. We are yet to actually begin to understand that we are connected somehow. So the challenge of trying to be inchanchu, the champion of the village by yourself, becomes problematic because it's not empowering. And also besides, because you are the only champion, every need is going to come knocking on your door.
Are you suggesting that Zimbabwe is self-centered?
We claim to have a framework of Ubuntu. And our solidarity is at solemn moments, during death, etc., etc. But I rarely come across cases where many youngsters with brilliant ideas are receiving funds from friends and family. Right. So many ideas are dying because a youngster only needs $1,000, or a youngster needs to travel to China, a youngster needs a piece of land, etc. So I think we're yet to translate our hunu Ubuntu values into the business space to begin to say, how do we support each other? No doubt there's some islands of best practice, mentoring. There's a lot of mentoring in Zimbabwe, by the way. There's a lot of it. Mentorship, coaching, etc. But youngsters are over-mentored. They are over-coached. They are not just being given money to start businesses. They're just not being given opportunities. So I'm not going to start another mentorship program, but I'm just looking and saying, how do you make sure that you actually put in their hands money and you trust them, even to fail? Because failing is part of the process.
We should start a new one and call it the practice program. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So if you ask, is there an alternative? All those are alternative ideas. Just to rethink, but to start small. Small is beautiful. The challenge with this government, they want big things. And Zimbabweans in general, they want big investments, etc. But small is beautiful. Start small, because when you're starting small, you are learning the trade, you are learning everything that you're doing. We're working with a videographer that you all can see. It's a small company. Before you know it, they may begin to grow their business. But because by now he's probably running it as a one-man show, he's learning every facet of the business.
Right.
Invoicing, sourcing for clients, doing the production. Then by the time he has person number 2, that person cannot tell him how things are done because he's already done everything. That's what we're saying. Let's give youngsters an opportunity to practice and to pilot these innovations.
Right. I love that alternative. So closing remarks. We've spoken about the development trajectory of the country, its challenges, the alternative, and what we can do, not what should the government do, what should your neighbor do, but what can we do as individuals. What are your closing remarks to this conversation?
So I think I like the framing from the beginning. What if there's an alternative? So the alternative is not a radical alternative. It's to temper the current model, because the current model leaves so many people behind. It creates inequality. So how do we deal with those gaps? Not from a welfare perspective, but from an agency creating perspective, being catalytic. So government should reposition itself to say it plays a catalytic role in entrepreneurial development, in national development, etc. So it promotes economic activity rather than inhibit through exorbitant licenses, tariffs, etc., and arresting people, etc. But it becomes a catalytic force. So that's very important for us to think about it, to say everyone who is trying to do a business, they mean well. They have no other choice. They're going out there to support their hustle so that they can support their families. Right. So it's important to acknowledge. Then they're also important to acknowledge, to say that our agriculture is too far behind. There's need to temper with new models. And also, we stand to benefit from learning from other Africans. So I always point people to a country like Kenya. Kenya is one of the few countries that never really had a dance with socialism. They've always been a capitalist society. So if you look at the innovations in the raw areas, they are far much more different, more diverse. So you learn on one side, they're talking about apple production, they're talking about strawberries, they're talking about avocados, others are doing sheep, others are doing goats. Very diverse. But here, chibage. Cotton. So we really need to be thinking through those changes and beginning to say, what are the new opportunities of the 21st century?
Right. And support our people with those new initiatives.
Exactly.
All right. The one statement that really caught my attention was, small is beautiful. I love that. And I think it's a statement that speaks to many of us. I was unemployed for a very long time with a degree, a master's degree for that matter. So, and there are many of us who are out there who've tried, small businesses, but you start and then, now trying to get your funding, trying to get people to support you. It's a story of many youths in Zimbabwe. And I think it's a very important conversation that we should have, that we should be pushing to the forefront. So thank you for that. So thank you so much for joining us today. Small is beautiful. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, it's a good place to start. If you have any comments around the discussion that we've had today, please make sure you write them in the comment. And if it's your first time here, please make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time to listen. Please feel free to rate and review us on iTunes. But if you have any comments or questions, please send them to my email, tendai.murisa@gmail.com, or hit us up on Twitter. My handle is @tmurisa. Thank you again.